In history, the most successful nations have not always been the richest or the most powerful. They have been the most observant. When the West began facing economic slowdowns, political instability, and social polarization, many countries reacted with fear. But India took a different approach. Instead of rushing to copy the West's systems or panic over its decline, India quietly watched. Every economic recession, every policy failure, and every technological shortfall in the West became a case study for India's own roadmap. This was not passive observation. It was active learning. India studied how debt crises shook economies, how overdependence on foreign manufacturing created vulnerabilities, and how political divisions weakened unity. These were not just headlines, they were warnings. And India understood that the best way to prepare for the future was to learn from the mistakes others were already making. By observing the West struggle with aging infrastructure, India accelerated its own investment in new technology, from digital payments to modern highways. By noticing the West's energy dependency on volatile markets, India diversified its energy sources, investing in solar, wind, and green hydrogen. By seeing the risks of relying too heavily on any one trade partner, India expanded its global alliances, reaching out to Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. The West's struggles also showed India the importance of cultural resilience. While many Western nations faced identity crises in the face of globalization, India embraced its diversity as a strength. This gave its people a shared sense of purpose, the belief that they were building something not just for one generation, but for centuries ahead. This patient, watchful strategy transformed India's global position. Instead of being caught in the same storms that shook the West, India had already enforced its economic, technological, and cultural foundations. It was like watching another ship hit dangerous waves and adjusting your own sails before the storm reached you. In the end, the West's struggles became more than just events happening across the ocean. They became a roadmap for India. And because India learned the right lessons at the right time, it now stands stronger, more prepared, and more confident about leading in a rapidly changing world. For decades, the world operated on the assumption that global trade was stable, predictable, and endless. Countries specialized in what they could produce cheaply and imported the rest. But when global trade faced sudden disruptions, from financial crises to pandemics and geopolitical conflicts, the system's weaknesses were exposed, supply chains broke, ships carrying essential goods were delayed for months, prices of basic commodities soared. India, like many nations, felt the shock waves. But instead of waiting for the global system to fix itself, India treated the disruption as a wake-up call. It realized that depending too heavily on imports for critical goods, from electronics to medical equipment, was a risk it could no longer afford. This urgency led to bold initiatives to strengthen domestic manufacturing. Programs like Make in India encourage global companies to set up factories locally, while Indian entrepreneurs received incentives to innovate and compete on the world stage. The pharmaceutical industry, once seen only as a supplier of generic medicines, began developing its own cutting-edge vaccines and drugs, as seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, when India became one of the largest vaccine producers for the world. India also invested in building its electronics and semiconductor capabilities, knowing that chips are the backbone of every modern device. Textiles, automobiles, and defense manufacturing saw similar transformations, with policies designed to not just meet domestic demand, but also make India a competitive exporter. This shift was not only about economics, it was about security and resilience. By producing more goods locally, India reduced its vulnerability to foreign supply shocks. It created jobs, fueled innovation, and gave its industries the confidence to compete globally. And something else happened. The mindset of the people began to change. Consumers started valuing homegrown products. Entrepreneurs saw opportunities where they once saw limitations, and policymakers began thinking in decades, not election cycles. Global trade disruptions might have caused panic in some countries, but for India, they became a catalyst for reinvention. By focusing inward and building upward, India turned vulnerability into strength and now stands as a nation that can not only weather future disruptions, but help lead the world through them. In the race toward the future, technology is the track, and speed matters. When many countries were still debating the risks and complexities of digital transformation, India was already running full speed ahead. The West, weighed down by legacy systems, regulatory bottlenecks, and slow policy changes, moved cautiously. But India took a bold leap. The foundation was laid with the Aadhaar biometric ID system, giving over 1 billion people a secure digital identity. This single step opened the door to a revolution in financial inclusion, governance, and service delivery. Suddenly, millions who had never even entered a bank could open accounts, receive subsidies, and make payments, all through a smartphone. Then came UPI, Unified Payments Interface, a simple, seamless, and nearly cost-free way to transfer money instantly. While some developed nations still relied on expensive, slow bank transfers or outdated check systems, India's street vendors, taxi drivers, and small shopkeepers were accepting instant digital payments with a QR code. This wasn't just technology for the elite, it was technology for everyone. In governance, India digitized services that once required hours of standing in lines. Birth certificates, tax filings, business registrations, processes that took weeks were now possible in minutes. Corruption dropped as transparency increased, and citizens gained trust in a system that worked faster and more efficiently. Meanwhile, India began making significant moves in artificial intelligence. Rather than seeing AI as a threat to jobs, India embraced it as a tool for growth, applying it in agriculture, healthcare, education, and disaster management. AI-driven solutions helped farmers get weather forecasts, doctors detect diseases earlier, and teachers customize learning experiences for students in remote villages. What made this leap unique was the mindset. India didn't just copy global tech models. It adapted them to its own needs. It built platforms that could handle scale, diversity, and affordability, something even the most advanced economies struggled to achieve. While others lagged behind, trapped in debates and outdated systems, India proved that speed, scale, and inclusion could go hand in hand. The result? A nation once seen as a technology follower became a technology leader. Not by waiting for permission from the world, but by building the future on its own terms. For decades, the size of India's population was seen as a challenge, even a weakness. Commentators spoke of too many mouths to feed and overpopulation, as if the country's growth was an unavoidable burden. But in reality, the numbers told a different story. Behind those 1.4 billion people were 1.4 billion possibilities. Minds that could innovate, build, and solve problems on a scale no other country could match. India recognized this and began shifting the narrative. Instead of seeing its population as a strain on resources, it treated it as a reservoir of untapped potential. The focus turned toward education, skill development, and entrepreneurship. Massive investments were made in engineering and technology institutes, vocational training centers, and online learning platforms that could reach even the most remote corners of the country. The result was a young, dynamic workforce that wasn't just ready for jobs. It was ready to create them. India became the hub for global IT services, not just because labor was affordable, but because talent was abundant and adaptable. From Silicon Valley startups to multinational corporations, Indian engineers, designers, and innovators began shaping technology and business worldwide. Creativity wasn't limited to the tech sector. In cinema, music, literature, and fashion, Indian voices started resonating globally. In science and medicine, researchers from India were contributing to breakthroughs in space exploration, pharmaceuticals, and sustainable energy. And in entrepreneurship, a new wave of startups was solving uniquely Indian problems, from rural banking to affordable healthcare, and exporting those solutions abroad. This shift was also powered by connectivity. Smartphones and cheap internet access meant that talent was no longer confined to big cities. A young coder in a small town could compete on the same global platforms as someone in New York or London. A designer in a village could sell to customers halfway across the world. By turning its population into a strength, India positioned itself differently from nations with shrinking workforces and aging demographics. While many economies worry about who will power their future growth, India has an answer. Millions of young, skilled, and ambitious citizens ready to lead the next era of innovation. What was once seen as India's biggest problem has become one of its greatest advantages, and the world is beginning to notice. In a rapidly changing world, speed often matters more than size. The West, with its complex regulations and deeply entrenched systems, often takes years to respond to new challenges. India, however, recognized that in the 21st century, hesitation is costly. When opportunities appeared or crises struck, it moved quickly, adjusting policies and creating an environment where innovation could thrive. One of the clearest examples was the rise of India's startup ecosystem. While many countries were still debating how to regulate new age businesses, India rolled out incentives, simplified registration processes, and opened up funding channels. From fintech to health tech, from e-commerce to clean energy, Indian startups began solving real problems at lightning speed. Government initiatives like Startup India, Digital India, and Atal Innovation Mission created a fertile ground for entrepreneurs. Tax breaks, easier compliance rules, and direct mentorship programs encouraged risk-taking, something that had once been culturally discouraged. The message was clear: if you have an idea, India will back you. Policy agility also extended to global trade and manufacturing. When global supply chains shifted, India moved fast to position itself as a reliable alternative. Special economic zones were set up, tariffs were adjusted, and production-linked incentive schemes attracted foreign manufacturers. This speed in decision-making allowed India to seize opportunities before competitors could react. Even in digital governance, India outpaced the West. While some developed countries were still wrestling with outdated bureaucracies, India implemented systems that delivered services directly to citizens' smartphones. Subsidies, pensions, and benefits could be transferred instantly, cutting out layers of inefficiency and corruption. But what made India's adaptation truly powerful was its combination of public policy and private initiative. Startups weren't working in isolation. They were often building on top of government-backed infrastructure like UPI, Aadhaar, and IndiaStack. This collaboration between the state and the private sector created speed without sacrificing scale. The result? India turned challenges into opportunities faster than many expected. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, it created them. Instead of fearing disruption, it embraced it. In a world where slow movers risk being left behind, India proved that agility, backed by bold policy and entrepreneurial energy, could be a nation's greatest competitive advantage. When powerful nations face decline in certain sectors, those gaps do not stay empty for long. They become opportunities for others to rise. As the West began losing its dominance in manufacturing, outsourcing, and certain technology sectors, India saw not just a void, but an open door. Instead of competing head-to-head in areas where the West was still strong, India targeted the spaces where momentum was fading. In manufacturing, rising labor costs in the West made production less competitive. India stepped in with lower costs, a large skilled workforce, and government incentives for companies to shift operations. Global electronics brands, automobile manufacturers, and textile producers began setting up factories in Indian cities, creating jobs and boosting exports. In IT services, as Western companies struggled with outdated infrastructure and high overheads, India offered flexible, efficient, and tech-savvy alternatives. The outsourcing boom was just the beginning. Soon, Indian firms were moving up the value chain into product development, cybersecurity, AI solutions, and global consulting. In pharmaceuticals, while some Western producers faced rising costs and shrinking pipelines, India expanded its generic drug manufacturing and biotech research. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when vaccine supply chains were strained, India emerged as a critical supplier to dozens of countries. Even in renewable energy, India filled gaps left by slower-moving economies. While some Western nations hesitated over clean energy investments, India committed to ambitious solar and wind power targets, attracting billions in green funding and building one of the world's largest solar farms. These moves were not just reactive, they were strategic. India understood that the global economy is like a chessboard. When one player pulls back, another can move forward. Each gap left by the West became a testing ground where India could experiment, innovate, and eventually dominate. The beauty of this approach is that it allowed India to grow without directly threatening the strongest areas of the West, avoiding unnecessary confrontations while still building influence. By turning others' weaknesses into its own playground for growth, India not only expanded its economy, but also diversified its strengths. Today, many of the spaces where the West once held an unshakable lead are now areas where India is setting the pace. And as more gaps appear in the global economy, India is ready to fill them faster, smarter, and on its own terms. In business, in life, and in nation building, one of the smartest ways to succeed is to watch others closely. Not just to copy their successes, but to study their failures. The West, for all its achievements, has made costly mistakes in governance, economics, and social policy. Instead of blindly following the same path, India treated these mistakes as warning signs and adjusted its own strategy. One clear example is debt dependency. Several Western economies have relied heavily on borrowing to fund growth, leading to unsustainable debt levels and painful economic crises. India took note. While it still faces fiscal challenges, it has generally kept debt levels in check compared to many developed nations, avoiding the crippling austerity measures that often follow debt explosions. Another lesson came from over-reliance on a few manufacturing hubs. When Western nations outsourced most of their production to cheaper labor markets, they enjoyed short-term cost savings, but when supply chains broke, they faced shortages of essential goods. India learned from this vulnerability, investing in local manufacturing and diversifying its trade partnerships to reduce exposure to single points of failure. Energy policy provided another warning. Some Western countries became too dependent on imported fossil fuels, leaving them vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. India, while still reliant on energy imports, began rapidly expanding renewable energy production to reduce future risks. Socially, India also learned from the pitfalls of cultural fragmentation. The West's struggles with political polarization and identity conflicts highlighted the need for unity in diversity. India has its own challenges, but it has worked to keep its cultural and linguistic variety as a strength rather than a source of permanent division. Even in technology, India observed how certain Western nations allowed a handful of corporations to dominate digital infrastructure, creating privacy concerns and stifling competition. In response, India developed open public digital platforms like UPI and Aadhaar that encourage innovation while keeping control in the public domain. By actively learning from others' errors, India avoided repeating them on a massive scale. It saved time, resources, and credibility, and positioned itself as a nation that could grow without falling into the same traps. In a world where some countries pay heavily for their missteps, India proved that wisdom is not just in doing things right, but in seeing what went wrong elsewhere and steering clear. In many parts of the world, rapid globalization and cultural shifts have triggered identity crises. Nations that once had a strong sense of who they were are now struggling to reconcile their heritage with the pressures of modern life. The result has often been social fragmentation, political polarization, and a loss of shared values. India, however, approached modernization differently. While embracing technology, global trade, and new ideas, it held tightly to the threads of its cultural heritage. Festivals, languages, spiritual practices, and family structures continued to thrive alongside modern infrastructure and innovation. This blend of the old and the new gave India a rare advantage, the ability to adapt without losing itself. From the Vedic philosophies that promote balance between material and spiritual life to the values of community and hospitality that bind villages and cities alike, India's traditions provide more than nostalgia. They offer a moral and social framework that guides behavior even in times of rapid change. These traditions serve as a compass, ensuring that progress does not come at the cost of identity. This cultural continuity has had tangible benefits. In times of crisis, whether economic downturns, natural disasters, or public health emergencies, India's strong community bonds have allowed it to mobilize quickly and support those in need. Neighbors help neighbors, extended families share resources, and religious institutions become centers of relief and resilience. In contrast, many nations facing identity crises have seen social trust erode. Without shared traditions, the sense of we becomes fragile, replaced by divisions along political, economic, or cultural lines. India's deep-rooted customs have acted as a safeguard against such fractures, giving it the internal stability that global investors and partners value. Moreover, India's cultural richness has become an export in itself. Yoga, Ayurveda, Bollywood, Indian cuisine, and classical arts have found enthusiastic audiences worldwide, enhancing India's soft power and global influence. By staying connected to its roots, India has not only preserved its unity, but also turned its heritage into a source of economic and diplomatic strength. In a century where many nations struggle to define themselves, India's example is clear. Progress is strongest when it grows from deep roots. By holding on to its traditions while moving forward, India has built a sense of unity that many others are now trying to rebuild. For decades, global leadership was largely concentrated in Western capitals. Nations around the world looked to the West for economic guidance, security partnerships, and technological breakthroughs. But in recent years, that confidence has begun to fade. Economic recessions, political polarization, and inconsistent foreign policies have made many countries question whether the West can still provide steady leadership in an increasingly uncertain world. In this shifting landscape, India quietly built a reputation for stability and dependability. While other powers were caught in cycles of internal division, India projected a consistent vision. Growth, cooperation, and mutual respect. It didn't try to dominate the conversation. It focused on delivering results at home and abroad. India's stable democratic institutions, despite their challenges, continued to function without major breakdowns. Its foreign policy maintained a careful balance, engaging with diverse blocs from the United States and Europe to Russia, Africa, and Southeast Asia, without being drawn into zero-sum rivalries. This diplomatic flexibility reassured partners that India was not prone to sudden shifts in alliances or unpredictable reversals. Economically, India kept expanding even when global markets were turbulent. By maintaining steady GDP growth, attracting foreign investment, and advancing reforms, it became a safe bet for companies looking for new markets and manufacturing hubs. In energy, technology, and trade, India honored its commitments and built a track record of reliability. On the humanitarian front, India's willingness to step up in times of crisis further boosted its credibility. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it supplied vaccines and medicines to dozens of countries, even while managing its own challenges. In disaster relief, it sent aid to neighbors and partners without hesitation. And these acts were not just goodwill gestures, they were proof that India could be counted on when it mattered most. As the West wrestled with its own uncertainties, many nations began looking elsewhere for partnerships that offered both stability and mutual benefit. India, with its growing economy, strategic location, and consistent diplomacy, emerged as one of the few countries capable of bridging divides and fostering trust across continents. In a world where reliability is becoming a rare commodity, India's steady rise has made it more than just an emerging power. It has made it a partner that others are willing to bet on for the long run. For much of modern history, India was seen as a nation trying to catch up, adopting technologies developed elsewhere, following global trends set by others, and adjusting to rules it did not create. But over the last decade, that image has transformed. India is no longer just reacting to the world, it is influencing it. The shift from follower to leader has been both deliberate and profound. In technology, India is no longer waiting for solutions to be imported. It is building them. Platforms like UPI have not only revolutionized domestic payments, but have also become models studied and adopted by other countries. India's space program, once underestimated, is now launching missions to the moon and Mars at a fraction of global costs, setting new benchmarks for efficiency and innovation. In global diplomacy, India has moved from being a participant in international discussions to shaping their agendas. It leads on issues like climate change, renewable energy, and digital governance, co-founding initiatives such as the International Solar Alliance to unite nations around clean energy goals. Economically, India's growth story is no longer about low-cost labor. It's about high-value innovation, research, and entrepreneurship. Indian startups are not just serving domestic markets, they are creating products and services with global reach. Sectors like pharmaceuticals, green energy, biotechnology, and AI are seeing India emerge as a source of original breakthroughs, not just a manufacturing base. Culturally, India's soft power is influencing lifestyles, wellness trends, and entertainment worldwide. Yoga, Ayurveda, Bollywood, and Indian cuisine have moved from niche interests to global phenomena, shaping how millions think about health, creativity, and identity. This leadership is also reflected in India's confidence. It no longer seeks validation from older powers before acting. Whether it is mediating in global disputes, providing aid in crises, or negotiating trade agreements, India moves with the assurance of a nation that knows it brings unique value to the table. The world has taken notice. Nations that once offered India advice are now seeking its insights. Global corporations are designing strategies with India at the center. And as the challenges of the 21st century, from technology disruption to climate change, demand new ideas, India is not waiting for permission to lead. It is already setting the pace, shaping the rules, and defining what the future will look like. The story of India's rise is not an accident. It is the result of watching carefully, learning constantly, and acting decisively. While others stumbled, India stood firm. While others hesitated, India moved forward. It turned crises into classrooms, weaknesses into opportunities, and diversity into unity. Today, India is not just keeping up with the world, it is setting the pace. It is proving that leadership in the 21st century will not belong to the loudest voices or the oldest overs, but to those who can adapt quickly, think boldly, and build inclusively. The West's struggles did not weaken India. They made it stronger, wiser, and more confident. And now, as the world faces challenges that no nation can solve alone, India is ready not only to take its place at the table, but to help shape the table itself. The message is clear. The future will not simply happen to India. India will help write it. And in doing so, it will not just change its own destiny. It will change the destiny of the world